You're listening to the Exceptional Girls Podcast, and I'm your host, Julie Withrow. As a mom who raised a twice exceptional young daughter, I know both the joys and the challenges of parenting a child who thinks, learns, and experiences the world differently. I also know how lonely it can feel and how long it can take to get answers. I created this podcast to increase awareness, understanding, and acceptance of female neurodivergence. In doing so, I hope to smooth the path for other families. Please join me for expert interviews and candid conversations about giftedness, ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and more. Let's learn together how we can make sure our exceptional girls feel seen, supported, and celebrated. If you've ever gotten parenting advice that just didn't seem to fit your child, this conversation is for you. In this episode of the Exceptional Girls Podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Danika Maddocks. Dr. Maddocks is a psychologist, gifted and twice exceptional parent coach, and founder of the Gifted Learning Lab. She helps parents move beyond standard parenting advice to create a family life that truly works for their unique child. Her approach is grounded in the neurodiversity paradigm and informed by more than 15 years of work with gifted and twice exceptional families as an educator, therapist, researcher, and consultant, as well as her own lived experiences as a twice exceptional individual and parent. In this conversation, Dr. Maddocks explains why traditional parenting advice often backfires for neurodivergent kids, and she shares approaches that are more effective. She talks about what's really going on beneath behaviors that can look defiant or overwhelming, why autonomy matters so much for our kids, and how a more collaborative approach can shift the dynamic between you and your child. If you're in the thick of a hard season as a parent, my hope is that this episode helps you feel less alone, more confident in your instincts, and more hopeful about what's ahead. Hi, Dr. Maddocks. Welcome to the Exceptional Girls Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here today. I'm looking forward to our conversation. We're going to be talking today about parenting gifted and 2E kids. And, really talking about how some typical parenting advice doesn't always apply to our kids and our situations. And, I suspect that many of our listeners have had moments where they realize that the advice that they're given by well-meaning family or friends just doesn't really seem to be working for them. And I remember myself as a parent when Remy was younger. I was thinking of a really specific example of this when this first kind of occurred for me. And it was when Remy was in Montessori school and they had transitioned to the lower elementary classroom. And this is when things started to, really come to light, that Remy was not really thriving in their school and in their classroom. And Remy was in the nurse's office, every other day, sometimes every day. And I was getting a lot of calls from school, that Remy was not in class and, Remy was showing up at the nurse's office. And I remember being really troubled by this because I worked 35 miles away from school and it was a lot of stress, right? Like, how was I going to deal with this situation? And everyone was telling me, oh, Remy's just looking for attention, don't indulge it. Just tell him to send Remy back to class and, you just go about your work and pick him up at the end of the day. And that just did not sit right with me. I just really felt like, it wasn't just attention seeking. And my gut told me that there was more going on than that. I just suspect that we have listeners, right now who are going through some of this, similar type of experience, right? Where the advice that they're getting just doesn't really feel right to them or doesn't really match what they think their child needs. And so I'd love to hear from you, what are some of the early indicators that they might be dealing, with that kind of mismatch, where the typical parenting advice is not going to be necessarily the right fit for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm sure you're right that there are lots of parents out there, right, who are experiencing that with their gifted or 2E or neurodivergent kid. And actually what you described, I think, is one of the best first signs where you said that you had a gut sense that something was off. And a lot of the parents that I work with and talk with do have that sense where some part of them knows or thinks, like this doesn't feel quite right, or a part of them hesitates to do what other people are telling them, or they do it, and they try to give it their best go and follow the advice that they're given, but then it just feels bad, right? Or it feels off. And I think a lot of parents, were taught to really listen to the experts and to kind of disconnect from our own discomfort, or we can be taught like, oh, that's your anxiety, you need to deal with that. It can get kind of pathologized for us, but I think it's for so many parents it is a really good indicator that there's something off about the advice they're getting, because a lot of times your kid, well, you definitely know your kid better than whoever is giving you the advice, right? Like you are an expert on your kid and your kid is an expert on your kid, right? And so I think when you hear that and you just know like, ooh, that doesn't feel right, or they're gonna like listening to that story, what came up for me was even thinking like, oh my gosh, but what would my kids say to me later if I just said like, just send them back to class, it's no big deal, and if you have a relationship with your kid where you understand them, a lot of gifted and 2E kids might say something later, of like, why did you do that? Or what happened? Or I thought this, I thought you would get me, or, there can be this sense of, almost like a broken trust, or like just confusion of like, but mom, like that, I
Mhm.
thought like when it's the two of us, we're like this. And I think that's another thing is like if there's a way that you're pulled to treat your kid one-on-one and then someone else is pushing you to do it a different way. um because I think so I guess that's like the parent part is like if you have that sense of like, I don't know if that's right, I hesitate to
Mhm.
do that, that's a good sign. And then in the kid, I think usually if a kid is having a hard time, there's something going on that's valid and reasonable, right? That we could benefit from understanding. And a lot of it, common advice is to kind of ignore, like punish or just don't give in, don't engage with that. And I think when our kids are having increased distress, they're having more challenges. Like that's a great example of like, wow, suddenly my kid is going to the nurse all the time or not feeling well or asking to come home or leaving class. And it's like something is up, So those are all good signs in your kid that, like if the typical advice, if you try it and it doesn't resolve those things quickly, right, then probably there's something else going on. So
Yeah, I think you said something really important that's probably hard for a lot of parents, and that's learning to trust your intuition, right?
yeah,
About what's going to be best for your kid. I think that can be especially hard sometimes for parents of gifted and 2E kids, especially because they may be gifted or 2E themselves. And so I
yes,
think, they can be extra diligent about parenting, like wanting to be the perfect parent, doing a
yes,
lot of
yes,
research, right? Like, and just really, wanting to be like the best parent. I know I
yes,
was like that. I spent a lot of time reading, a lot of time trying to figure things out. And I mean, I think it's only natural to want, to seek answers. But
yeah,
I think sometimes as parents of these kids and having some of these tendencies, we can become very hyper focused on being really good parents too. And
yeah,
finding good guidance can be really hard. I think it's a little easier now. There are specialized, people, professionals like you, which makes it
right,
easier. But still, there's a lot of advice out there that just isn't going to work for neurodivergent kids.
yeah,
And I'm curious, what are some of the most common, parenting pieces of advice that people get that
yeah,
tend to backfire, with gifted or
yes.
neurodivergent kids?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the one of the ones that comes up the most and that applies to lots of situations is this idea that parents need to be consistent and that consistency is key. And that is communicated in a lot of different types of parenting content too.
Mm-hmm.
Everything from like more rewards and punishment based systems require consistency, but even like gentle parenting or things like that, we'll talk about, being consistent is important. And this idea that if you set a boundary, you need to stick to it. You can't say one thing and then go back on it or let your kid convince you of something else. And I think that idea leads to so much unnecessary conflict and stress and like distress between parents and their children. And it really relates, I think, to that, like you're saying, that desire to do a really good job. So many parents who come to me almost apologize of like, I'm sorry, I wasn't as consistent as I should have been, or it's probably my fault, and blaming themselves for being inconsistent. But actually, like when I work with parents, I encourage them not to be inconsistent exactly, but I encourage them to let go of the idea that consistency is key because I think that assumes that our kids are consistent from moment to moment or day to day, or that we are, or that the context is. And a lot of times, our neurodivergent kids have like extreme fluctuations in their capacity. So something they could do one day, they may not be able to do the next day, or maybe they can brush their teeth and get dressed in the morning, but by bedtime, the idea that they could get ready for bed independently is, it's just totally overwhelming. They're just exhausted from their day. And if you have a consistent rule of like, you're old enough, you do, you change your clothes, like you do that on your own, it's just going to lead to so much stress that doesn't need to be there. So I really encourage parents to be less like focused on this idea of almost like arbitrary consistency and more focused on this idea of really aligning with their kid's capacity and what their kid needs in the moment. Um, I think there's this idea that consistency is necessary because it helps kids feel safe, and a lot of times parents are told, like, you need to keep a boundary because kids are going to push against it and they want to know that you're going to hold it. But in my experience, a lot of gifted and 2E kids want to know that you're going to listen to them and that you're going to bend it and be flexible and be a team with them if they say like, I can't do that right now, or it's too hard, or just 5 more minutes, like and that can actually be more effective over time. So that's probably the biggest piece of advice that leads to the most distress, and it's a bad fit for a lot of parents of gifted 2E kids.
I think that's really validating because I know for me, now I'm farther along in the journey, but I know for me, I always had a lot of angst about that. I
Yeah.
wasn't a super consistent parent. And I remember really feeling bad that way, that it was
Yeah.
so hard for me to be consistent. It just wasn't really in my nature to be
Yeah.
consistent.
Yeah.
But to your point, I also think it wasn't really going to work so well for my kid either,
Right.
because to your point, there was such a, ebb and flow of like what was going to work and what wasn't going to
Yeah.
work. But that was also my natural state too, right? Like I
Yeah.
don't think either
Yeah.
one of us were going to be able to dance in this consistency very well, So I
Right.
think, yeah, so that's very validating. I hope that's validating for other people listening
Me
too.
too. Yeah, yeah. Well, and I would even like go a step further and like often I will praise parents for their inconsistency because and I don't know if this is your experience, but a lot of times parents are like, okay, I'm gonna be consistent, I'm gonna hold this boundary, but then they have a gut sense of like, this isn't working for my kid, or this is not reasonable in this moment, and that's why they are lenient and flexible.
Yep.
And that's actually amazing. That is a connection and attunement to your kid that's like, that's great. But then so many parents feel like, now I have failed according to the parent report card, right? When actually they've done a really great job of attuning to their kid and building trust and like just, attunement is more important than consistency, I guess. So
Yeah.
well
Yeah.
done.
Well, and I love that, the idea of attunement. So that's great, right? If things are fairly manageable, but let's talk about like when things get kind of unmanageable.
Sure.
I think with a lot of kids who are gifted or 2E, there is this intensity of emotion, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes as parents, we're managing behavior that seems especially irrational or
Hmm. Hmm.
defiant or oppositional.
Yeah.
And I think in those moments, it the attunement part is hard to maintain
Yeah.
because it doesn't make, it's hard to make sense of it.
Yeah.
Sometimes the behavior just seems totally out of proportion to the situation.
Right.
But I think, when you encourage families in those situations to consider that maybe there's something more going on. Can
Yeah.
you talk more about that?
Yeah, yeah, I think I guess like I come from this assumption that, but I think it's borne out in the data, if that makes sense. Like that I do think there's always like some valid root cause going on for the kid. And it's so common that our neurodivergent kids have really large, like you're saying, really intense emotional reactions to things that to us as adults seem like not a big deal, right? Where it's and it can be very surprising or confusing. And sometimes we know what's upsetting them, it's like, oh my gosh, I gave them, their food and the food was touching and I know that they hate that, right? But
Yep.
we can be like, one part of us can be like, it's not that big a deal or just move it apart. They're both dry foods. They're not, they haven't commingled, like, okay. Um, and another part of us, I think, can know like, that's really overwhelming to my kid, right? And that they rely on some amount of predictability. And even though it's not a big idea to me, right, it might have a real sensory yuck for them, right? Or it might really distress them to have things touching versus separate because they need more predictability when they're going to eat. Maybe eating is overwhelming. I think there's often like that would be a good example of something else that's going on is like a lot of our kids have underlying just differences in how they perceive the world, or they may have sensory sensitivities that make something that seems kind of simple, like putting on socks and shoes. Like for some kids, putting on socks is like so stressful because they never feel right or the seams bother them, So it, from an adult's perspective, it may be like, it's just socks, or come on, it's not that big a deal, or I got you the softest socks I could find. But for the kid who maybe is stressed about going to school and finds transitions hard and is now putting on uncomfortable socks, it's just like, they might explode. So I really I think I encourage parents to kind of like try to connect with what makes sense about the child's experience. And even if you don't know and you're not sure exactly what it is, if you can try to validate something about their experience or just feed it back to them of kind of like, I see you, I see that this is really stressful with the socks. That can cause, it can help kids de-escalate a lot. And a lot of parents will tell me that it just calms their kids down. Because I think what happens over time, and this may have happened to a lot of us when we were kids, is that like those big reactions are really seen as like wrong, kind of, like
Hmm.
and even in therapy training and things or like OT, occupational therapists, I hear a lot of therapists will talk about this idea of trying to like, let's teach the kid to right size this problem, or like you're
Yep.
having a big reaction, but is this a big problem? And it's like, well, to me as an adult, no, but to that child, it's a huge problem. And I think it can be so invalidating to be told like, you're just overreacting, you just need to stop having a big feeling. And a lot of kids over time will start to think like, I'm a bad person. What's wrong with me? Why am I so intense? Why am I overreacting all the time? And they can start to really dislike themselves or hide those parts of themselves or, feel ashamed. So even though it is hard as a parent to be compassionate or try to see your kid's perspective when they seem to be exploding over a little thing, but I think there's usually something really going on there, and it can be so healing and actually make life a little easier to just be like, oh man, that food was touching. No good. I'll be right back. Let me redo, or whatever it is. So I know that's not always possible for us to regulate in that moment, but that practicing that approach, I think, can really decrease the intensity at home, and be helpful over time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great advice, right? Because I think this is a pretty common experience for a lot of parents that
Yeah.
there are these things that seem so not a big deal to
Right.
us as parents. And but you also bring up a good point. Maybe if we were to think back or remember back, we maybe
Yeah.
had similar experiences. And I do think these things can be a little triggering sometimes, and maybe we don't even remember that. But there's there's a
Yeah.
lot to unpack there sometimes. But
Yeah.
but yeah, you also talk about the importance of autonomy. And I
Yeah.
think that also plays into this a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Like why is autonomy such an important need, for many of our kids? And how does that change the way, parents might approach giving their kids opportunities for control and decision making and things like that?
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I've always been interested in autonomy, like my whole career. Even like when I was a teacher, I was really interested in like giving kids a sense of autonomy and choice in the classroom. And then in graduate school, I did a lot of like research around motivation. And in motivation research, right, there's this idea that autonomy is actually like a universal basic human need for well-being, and that it's one of the key things that supports intrinsic motivation, where you're just naturally intrinsically motivated to do something. So really, like all humans benefit from autonomy, and there's a lot of research showing that kids do better when their parents support autonomy and give them control and choice, or when their teachers do in the classroom. And it makes sense if you think like none of us really likes to be controlled, right? Like, um, and I think for gifted and 2E kids, and then that there is a stronger need for autonomy. Like, I don't know that there's any research that shows that, but I just see it and hear it all the time. And I think it kind of makes sense if you think like a lot of in a way, like our society is kind of built with this idea that like adults should be in charge because adults are older, and then therefore they're in charge, which is a little bit
Hmm.
arbitrary. And a lot of gifted kids can look at what the adults are doing and they might be able to think of a way that would be better for them to do it. Or they may see that the adults are being ineffective or not making sense, or, that can happen at school or at home sometimes. And I think for a gifted kid to be told you need to do it this way when they're like, that's not the only way to do it. They can kind of think around arbitrary rules and be like, no, 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 like I have a better way, or that's inefficient, or, they may tell their teacher, like, that's actually wrong, like,
Hmm.
um, and so I think that can lead to gifted kids wanting more say. And then for like kids who are twice exceptional, who are maybe autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, neurodivergent in another way, I, I'm not exactly sure, but I think that there's an extra need for autonomy just because so many standard ways of doing things are not really a fit for them. So just all the things that they're told to do like aren't a good fit. They're not aligned with them. So of course I think they want more control over themselves because they're like, hey, the way this food is served is gross to me. I can't eat it. I need food in a different way. Or going through a bunch of tasks in the morning with no time for my interests doesn't work for me. Like I need another way to do it. And so I think they're just naturally trying to figure out a way to do life that works better for them. And it just isn't this often the standard way of doing things. So they want more control or more say. Um, One like key thing that I see a lot is that like our society kind of equates autonomy and independence. And like a lot of neurodivergent kids don't want independence with daily tasks. So parents will kind of be like, well, you're saying they want autonomy, but like they don't want to put their own shoes on? And so I think what kids crave when they crave autonomy is they want autonomy to like do the things they like and choose the things they enjoy, but they also want autonomy to have like freedom from things that are very stressful for them, or to be able to opt out of stuff they don't like, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Um, so weirdly, you can support your kids' autonomy by like, giving them some free time in the morning to do whatever it is that they feel like doing, and by helping them put their shoes on, like just as a matter of course before you leave instead of asking them to do it on their own. And both of those things could feel really autonomy supportive or really regulating for a kid who otherwise might find the morning routine super stressful. So,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it also It also makes me want to talk for a minute about PDA because
Sure.
I think it's one of these newer things I feel
Yeah.
like that people are hearing a lot more about, but I don't think a lot of people really understand it or there's a lot of good information about it.
Yeah.
But I know that the clinical name for it is pathological demand avoidance, but I know that you have a different definition for it, and a lot of other people do. But can you talk about
Yeah.
PDA a little bit because I feel like it's one of those
Yeah.
things that relates here.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, so a lot of PDAers prefer the term persistent drive for autonomy or pervasive drive for autonomy. So kind of reclaiming that PDA acronym. And, I think it's right that it's like sort of like the knowledge about PDA is developing. Especially there's not as much like empirical research about it, but there is a lot of people speaking up about their lived experience as PDAers, if that framework really resonates with them, or people raising kids who they're like, oh, this kid really fits with this PDA framework. And that's my kid. And as I learn more about it, I actually question if I'm a PDAer as well. Like,
Same.
yes, yeah, I'm like, this resonates. And when I explain it to parents, sometimes parents are like, oh, well, that sounds like me, like,
Hmm.
um, the way I think about it, and I think I guess I'll say too, as a caveat, I think it's really helpful for all parents of gifted kids to learn about PDA and PDA informed approaches because so many gifted kids have traits that are similar to PDAers, even if they may not meet, kind of all the criteria, right? Or like all the pieces. But so many gifted kids benefit from that PDA informed parenting approach. And it's
Hmm.
so different than traditional parenting wisdom. So I think it's helpful for parents to learn about. I think of it, the two key things that I think of are that strong need for autonomy, where you'll just see. I think once you know to look for it, you can see it come up in all kinds of places throughout the day, right? But this is a kid who really like not only wants autonomy and freedom, in how they choose to lead their lives or do things, but they also, I think, are very stressed by limits on their autonomy and can really be overwhelmed by feeling controlled, and some kids will fight, or scream or yell, some will run away or just shut down. I was more like some will fawn and people please as a way to feel safe or in control. But I think I can give a good example of like I had a funny conversation with my kid where he was sort of saying like, um, like kind of like no one really has to do anything. And I don't remember how we even got on this, right? But he was sort of, and he's 7. I think he was 6 at the time. He's like, no one has to do anything. And I was sort of like, you're right. And I have this PDA framework in mind. So I'm like, this is a really important concept for him to know that like yeah, no one can make you do anything. There's nothing you have to do, right? That is the ultimate freedom. And I was like, there are some things like that have consequences if you don't do them. Like if you didn't drink water, you would get dehydrated over time. And he's like, right. And if you don't drink water long enough, you'll die, And I was like, right. And I was like, and your body kind of automatically will breathe, And he's like, right, but you don't have to breathe. You could just die. I was like, wow, like this is a kid who's like, look, 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 you have the ultimate control. And that's really soothing to him, right? To be
Yep.
like, no one can make me do things. And so I just love I think that gets so pathologized in our society because we don't want to give kids a lot of autonomy usually. We do just want them to follow what adults say. Um, but I don't know. I find it lovely and very like liberating to attune with that and to be like, you've got
Yeah.
a point, kid. You're right. So, but it's such a different approach to parenting to kind of be like, I'm not the one in charge just because I say so. It can be really helpful to have a more collaborative relationship with a kid who has a strong need for autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, it really does challenge the traditional hierarchical relationship that
Yeah.
I think a lot of people were raised with, right? I think that's probably difficult. I mean, people might understand it conceptually, but maybe they don't understand how to put it into practice.
Yeah.
Can you share maybe some examples or paint a picture of what it looks like
Yeah.
when this is working well, when parents do have this different type of relationship with their kids where it
Yeah.
isn't, I'm the parent and therefore I set the rules and everything is
Right.
do as I say, not as I do, and blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
can you help paint the picture of what that looks like?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think when it's working well, it really looks more like a collaborative partnership, where each person has needs and desires about things that are going to happen in the family or in their life. And the adult may still have ideas in mind about around like certain boundaries of like, I'm going to help my kid stay safe or I'm going to help my kid care for their body. But as parents, there's often a lot of unlearning and kind of letting go of a lot of pressures and just like shoulds, all these things that like you should be doing or have to do. Um, where I think parents will kind of, a lot of parents who have a PDA or approach parenting in this way that's really autonomy supportive kind of let go of so many pressures, even just the idea that like, it may be like, well, I thought we had to do after school or extracurricular programs, but my kid really just wants to like have time at home after school to do what they want to do, right? And that's when they're best. So, okay, I'm gonna let go of that. We don't need to do that, Or sometimes there's fewer screen time limits because they see that their kid uses screen time as like something that's regulating and relaxing, or one of their top interests is, doing Minecraft or Pokemon or something that involves the screen or coding. So they, sort of like, I think challenge a lot of the rules around like that's bad, and they can look and be like, is this bad for my kid, and kind of talk with the kid, and maybe they'll say like, hey, I'm a little concerned that if you're on the screen all the time you're not moving your body at all, and moving our bodies can be beneficial. And some kids will be like, okay, I can move my body, I'm just going to go run around the basement like 10 times and then I'll come back to this. And it's like, okay, like, right. And I'll talk with parents about really getting clear about like what is our ultimate goal and then what else could be flexible. And in that flexibility, being able to talk with your kid about how can we figure out a way that this works for both of us or for all of us. Right. So if the goal is like my kid gets some physical exercise during the day, there's a million ways you could do that, right? And it can be um, just a conversation with the kid of like, hey, this is why I have this thing in mind or why I think this would be helpful. And here's some options, right? Or why don't we do this? Or let me roll you in a blanket or just a lot of like collaborative problem solving. There can be more playfulness. But I think it really does as parents. It's helpful as if the parents can let go of some of the pressures on themselves too, that just letting go of things that stress them out, so maybe the house doesn't have to be as clean as, they think it does, or trying to like let go of all these shoulds and pressures on everyone in the family, if that makes sense. I don't
Yeah,
know
it
if, I
makes
don't know
a
if that's concrete enough, but yeah.
well, I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, and you've said some things along the way that I think are worth emphasizing, and that is, you said this back at the beginning. You're the expert on your child, and your child is the expert on themselves, right?
Yes.
On
Yes.
themselves. And I think that bears repeating because we are not trained as parents to really believe that
Right. It's true.
that our
Yeah.
kids know themselves.
Yeah.
And not only can we trust our instincts about what our kids need, but we can listen to our kids when they tell us what they need.
Yes, yes, yes. And gifted PDAers, in my experience, are amazing at saying what they need, but it often is things that we have been taught to discount or not listen to, right? And or kids will even be like, this is so upsetting. Like, the only thing that would help right now is if I had a piece of candy, or like if I could have 15 minutes of screen time. And we're taught to be like, you can't cope with that. That's not good. That's not healthy. That's bad. But actually, that
That's
that can
right.
be a lot of adults cope that way. And our kid is telling us, I would feel so much better if you just let me do this right now, So
Yeah. Well, and to use a big example, I'll share one because for Remy, when when they were moving from elementary school to middle school, that's when the wheels really came off. And I imagine that happens for
it's a hard
a lot of
time.
kids, right?
Yeah.
Because there's just a lot more demands on them socially,
Yeah.
executive function wise, all those things, right?
Yeah.
And Remy said to me, I would be so much happier if you would just homeschool me.
Yes.
And I was
Yes.
like, what? homeschool you? Like, no, I have a full-time job, I have a career. There's no way I can do that. I don't have the patience for it. There were a
Yeah.
million reasons why I couldn't do it. Uh, I couldn't wrap my head around it. I couldn't believe that that could
Yeah.
be a possibility for a lot of reasons. Other people were like, "Oh, Remy's just trying to manipulate you because they don't want to go to school," right? All these
Right,
things.
right.
But finally, in seventh grade, when things got bad enough that Remy was so dysregulated that
Yeah.
they could barely sleep, could barely make it to school, I
Yeah.
listened and I withdrew Remy from school and we
Yeah.
homeschooled.
Yeah.
And Remy became a different kid. Like, well, they slept for about 10 days and then they were
Yes.
a
They're
different
like
child.
full reset. Like,
Correct.
yes.
And they
Yeah.
really became a different kid. Like they became the like kid who loved to learn again, like autodidactic, like
Yes.
all the things. And
Yes.
Remy turned a corner. And Remy will tell you, in fact, I'm pretty sure Remy said it on an early episode, that that was a turning point in our relationship because I finally listened.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, like
Yes.
but these
Yes.
this is like one of those stories, right? That I
Yeah.
think people parents like us need to hear
Yes.
because I resisted and I resisted and I resisted. But once
When
I
people
listened,
told you, not experts, right, can tell you
oh
like, don't do
yeah,
that, don't do that. That would
that's
be
right.
bad.
And
And
I
the
had
kid's like,
to
just listen to me. Like, yeah.
That's right. And even after I made the decision, my family was like, "What? What are you
Yeah.
doing?" And I had to stand firm in my ground, which took a lot of personal resolve and strength, right, to do that.
Yes.
But I knew in my gut it was the
Yeah.
right thing because I saw the
Yeah.
changes happen so quickly,
Yes.
and in my kid. And so I
That's
think that,
amazing.
yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean, but it really reinforces what you said. Remy knew what they needed and they were telling me what they needed. I just wasn't listening.
Yes, yes. And I think, and that's a really common one is like kids letting their parents know like school's not working. And it can be in all different ways. It can be going to the nurse's office, right? Like, no, but I think that's a really tricky one when you have a gifted kid too, I think. And I
Hmm.
don't know if you experience this, but then a lot of parents feel the pressure of like, no, you need education, you need to be challenged, you need to go to this place.
Totally.
But a lot of times, I think our kids do have great insight of like, this is not a healthy setting for me, or this is not giving me what I need. I'd be so much happier if I were right at home, learning on my own. And it can be surprising to a lot of parents. So I think it is good for parents to know that's actually a pretty common thing that kids have good insight about and will be like, this is not a good fit for me. I need a different place or I need to come home. Like,
That's right. And I mean, and I'm not suggesting that all kids would be like Remy, but yeah, once Remy
right,
was on there,
right.
I mean, before this, Remy was so unmotivated, but
Yeah.
once Remy had was regulated and
Yeah.
had
Yeah.
autonomy, they came up with their own curriculum.
Yeah.
They were self-teaching, right? They
Yes.
they
Yes.
they just needed to have some room to regulate and some autonomy and my support. And
Yeah.
then,
And
they
feeling
figured,
connected with you in that
yep.
trust. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
huge. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just one of those examples, right? Like I said, I wouldn't
Yeah.
suggest that's necessarily going to work for everybody, but
Right, right.
in
And
our
I
case, it
yeah.
was huge.
Yes, exactly. And I'll acknowledge like not every family can change schools or pull kids out, but even just listening to your kid and validating,
Hmm.
like because I'll have parents too be like, well, I don't want to badmouth the teacher. And it's like, well, you don't have to, but you can say, like, wow, that does sound really unfair. Or like, I can
Yes.
see why you were frustrated, and like really just listening to their teacher and validate maybe seeing like, huh, I wonder if we could talk with this person, or I wonder if we could change things, or maybe they could get a 504 or some kind of support. So just this idea of being a team together, I think is huge. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And that's also a big part of our story, right? And as we wrap up our conversation, like this is a perfect place for us to to conclude because
Sure.
the biggest takeaway that I would love people to have from our conversation, and I think you would too, is that as parents, learning to trust your intuition around
Yeah.
these things, and you need support to do that. And that's what I hope this podcast begins to give people, is that support to know that they can trust their intuition around these things, and trust their gut if
Yes.
things don't sound right. If this advice doesn't fit you, then
Right.
don't feel like you need to follow it, right?
Right. Right.
And I was thinking, I usually ask the same question of my guests at the end, and it's, something along the lines of, if you were to, give parents one piece of advice coming out of our conversation, what would it be? But I'm going to change it up a little bit. So Remy was home from college last week for spring break, and Remy's 20 now and in their third year of college. And it's so gratifying to see them thriving in school. And it is not like that was a foregone conclusion.
Right. Right.
About the same time, well, this story that I told is really relevant, because leading up to that, man, I didn't know if Remy was even going to graduate high school, to be honest. Like,
Right.
I
Right.
mean, Remy was in a very dysregulated, very not good place mentally
Yeah.
and emotionally. And so, I was really, like I said, I didn't even know if we were going to make it through high school at that point. It was a very dark
Yeah.
time. And so now to see, Remy really thriving, and with their whole future ahead of them, it's really it's just so heartwarming and rewarding, to see this. But it really, like, I don't forget though,
Right.
where
Right.
we came from. And I have the benefit, of hindsight now. And the journey was full of a lot of ups and downs, right? But
Yeah. Yes.
I still really remember the down times, when I was so worried about how I was doing as a parent. I was so worried
Yeah.
about them. And, I know that there are people listening who are in that place right
Yeah.
now. And so my question for you as we conclude is, for parents who are in that really hard season,
Yeah.
who are worried about their child or questioning, how they're doing as a parent, what's one thing that you wish they could hold on to that might give them hope and perspective?
Yeah, it's so hard to choose just one. Like, I think the thing that comes to mind for me is that, and I talk about this in my coaching program with parents a lot. I think the heart of the neurodiversity paradigm is this idea that like there is no one right or best or healthiest way to be a human. There are infinite ways to be a healthy, good, well human. And our society really, I think, teaches us that there is this narrow band of acceptable behavior and this narrow band of acceptable outcomes. And that if you're not fitting in that, you're failing. And that causes so much distress for our kids and for us. So I really I believe in like that there is nothing wrong with any kid, like there's just not like, and for parents, like your kid can be really suffering, but they're not like broken. There's nothing wrong with them, right? They just need help finding a way to like be themselves and for that to be okay and to be trusted by their adult. And so I just think that knowing that like there's not a wrong way to be. There's so many different ways to go to learn, right? There's so many different ways to eat, to have a meal time, to dress yourself, to, any realm you're looking at, so that parents can feel less pressure, like they have to get their kids to do things a certain way. But can I add one more thing too? I know
Please. Yeah,
one.
please.
Because I think the other thing that comes up a lot is like so many parents who do my program talk about how healing it is to hear that other families are going through similar things. And you'd be amazed at how often, even like seemingly silly little things that are like, annoying or stressful can be something that it's like, wait, three of the kids in this group do that? Like, oh, okay, right? Or your kids said that exact same thing to you. Wow. And parents have told me then they feel so much less worried that there's something like wrong, really individually wrong with their kid. But then we're like, oh, this is like a thing. This is like a way that kids like this deal with the world. They touch their mom's butt in public when they're stressed, or whatever it is. Or it's like they're not just like a bad, weird kid. Like that is a semi-common way that gifted 2E kids manage the stress of feeling like I actually need to get out of here or I need to get back a sense of power or something. So that's kind of a silly example, but it does come up a lot. And I think so that I guess the other part is like for parents who are feeling so alone and so in the dark, and the experts or whoever you've connected with, it doesn't feel right to try to find a community that does, and to connect with people who get it more. And maybe it's researching PDA and seeing if your kid has some of those qualities and needs a different type of support, right? Or maybe it's connecting with, NAMI is like a group that connects parents who are dealing with like mental illness or challenges in their family. There's different ways to connect with people who are going through something similar, but I think that can be so de-shaming, and can sometimes help with practical ideas too, or like permission to do things differently.
Yeah, I think that's such great advice. It can be very lonely. I've said this many
Yes.
times. It can be very lonely parenting,
Yeah.
a gifted or 2E kid,
Yeah.
especially when you haven't found your community of people who
Yes.
understand it. So I do think that's so important, and I'm glad that you mentioned it. And thanks again for being here today. I know that this advice is going to be really helpful to someone listening today, and that's exactly why I was so excited to do this episode, because I know that people need to hear this. So
Yeah.
thanks again for being here and sharing your expertise with my audience. I
My
appreciate it.
pleasure. So happy to share. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Exceptional Girls podcast. If you liked today's episode, it would mean the world to me if you'd subscribe, leave a rating and review, and recommend it to just one other person who you think would benefit from listening. Even a small act of support helps the podcast reach more people, which in turn helps increase awareness and understanding of exceptionality in girls. And if you have suggestions for future episodes, please share them. You can connect with me, your host, Julie Withrow, through our website at exceptionalgirlspodcast.com/contact.